From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And ahead today during our first half hour, K-State's Romulo Lollato discussing the strategic selection of winter wheat varieties to be planted this fall, which goes beyond choosing seed based on yield potential alone. He's asking you producers to consider several other variables, including aligning that yield potential with the actual production capabilities of a given field and factoring in variety tolerance for abiotic stresses such as soil acidity. Romulo will cover all of that and more next. Further ahead, this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Rebecca McMahon will discuss the prospects of succeeding with homegrown berry gardening in Kansas. All that and more next on this Agriculture Today. You are tuned in to Agriculture Today. As always, we appreciate you listening. About a week ago now, exactly a week ago, as a matter of fact, we debuted a new undertaking by K-State Research and Extension and the Kansas Wheat Commission. It's called Wheat RX, an informational resource for you wheat growers on intensive wheat management. We want to talk about one of the first entries in that series today, and that is wheat variety selection. We'll do so with K-State Research and Extension wheat production specialist Romulo Lollato aboard once more. But Romulo, before we do that, you have been on the road, hard at the string of pre-plant wheat meetings that K-State Research and Extension has been putting on and will continue to do so in the weeks ahead. Wanted to ask you, what are some of the more common things that wheat producers are bringing to your attention or wondering about as you interact with them at these pre-plant schools?
Hi, Eric. Yes, well, first, thank you for having me on air again here. I always appreciate it and enjoy talking to our wheat growers out in the state. Yes, we have been for the last couple of weeks having several pre-plant wheat meetings. Now, we are a little bit lower in number this year compared to past years, mostly because there's still some lingering concerns with COVID. And so some of the county agents chose to either not do it this year or do a virtual fashion. But we had some really good meetings ranging anywhere from 20, 25 growers all the way to about 75 growers or so. And growers seem to be very interested. I think that the fact that the wheat price is favorable this season, $7+ a bushel there, has growers quite interested in maximizing what they can take out of the crop, right? And really, that's the idea behind what you mentioned, the Wheat RX program there. How can we grow high yield and high quality wheat, but very importantly, in a sustainable way? And that sustainable includes the economics, right? It includes making sure that we're making more profit. So some of the overarching themes of these pre-plant meetings and producers' questions, of course, variety selection has been a big one. We don't need to get on it right now, as we're going to talk about it here in a few minutes, but variety selection has been a big one. We always talk about timeliness and precision of operations as well to make sure that we can establish a high potential of the crop. And what I mean by that, a little bit more specific, is making sure that we are around the optimal planting date for the crop, because that way we're at least giving the crop the opportunity to reach the potential. If we're going too late or if we're going too early, we're hurting the crop on different ways, right? If we're going too early, we can have different viral diseases that can affect the crop. They're going to be more prevalent in an early planting. The crop can grow too much and use too much water early on and run dry later in the season when it really matters. And if we're planting too late, simply the crop doesn't have as much time to tiller. And so we have a peak, and that peak ranges from around September 25th in the northwest corner of the state to as late as about October 10th to October 15th in south central Kansas. So just making sure that timeliness, very important, being on time in our operations. In terms of precision, we talk about treating wheat as we treat some of the other crops like soybeans or corn, where we know exactly what's the population that is going in, right? If we're shooting for that 1 million seeds per acre or that 1.2 million seeds per acre, that we're doing everything in our power to get there. And that includes first knowing the seed size of the variety that we're planting so we can adjust pounds per acre to the number of seeds per acre. That's a very quick conversion as long as we know the seed size. And things that affect our stand establishment. For example, seed quality, right? Making sure that we're planting a high quality seed. We also talk quite a bit about fertility, right? Because fertility is one of the factors that will, what I like to call yield building factors. If we don't have fertility out there, it's like having a tank of a car with not much gas. And so that fertility is going to allow the crop to go further, right? To whatever the potential of that environment is based on weather conditions. But the fertility being there, it can build that yield potential of the crop. And we discussed quite a bit the nitrogen management of nitrogen as well as sulfur and phosphorus. So many of these things that are on growers' minds in terms of provide some early season phosphorus right now for the crop to really get going with a good stand establishment in the fall and a good potential for tillering in the fall. And then later on splitting our nitrogen so we're actually using it more efficiently, right? Many times I'm sharing some data with growers that the only difference that we have is timing of application, same nitrogen rate. And we see that if we have 100% applied in the fall in a wheat crop that is going after soybeans, we're planting late. It doesn't have a lot of time to tiller in the fall, right? That crop might uptake a maximum of maybe 70 or 80 units of nitrogen in the season. Whereas this very same nitrogen amount, but is split between maybe a 40% in the fall, 60% at green up, that uptake by the crop can go north of 120. So we're looking at the very same nitrogen rate, but the crop uptaking perhaps over 50 units more just because of we're giving it when it needs the most and is less exposed to losses through leaching or nitrification, volatilization, right? So that's a part of our pre-plant wheat meetings as well, just fertility management. And I guess finally, another thing that we talk about is fungicide management. This is not something that growers are necessarily concerned right now, but something that can affect their variety selection, right? If they already know that they're not willing to put out further fungicide in the spring, well, they need to go with a variety with good resistance to especially stripe rust, but also leaf rust, for example. If he's willing to put out a fungicide, well, then he has considerable more options in terms of varieties right now. So to some extent, it affects their fall decisions. But really what we're mostly showing growers there is that we recently summarized about 12 years of fungicide response data together with Eric DeWolf and Kelsey Anderson. And on average of these 12 years and over almost 400 comparisons of fungicide versus no fungicide across most of the state, if a variety is resistant or intermediate resistant to the majority of the diseases, we're still getting on average 6-7% yield gain from having that foliar fungicide. Now, if we have a susceptible variety to the majority of the diseases, that jumps up to 16-17%, right? So a large opportunity to increase yields with a relatively low cost, depending on the fungicide that is used. And of course, that chance can be much greater in seasons when we have more rainfall. Many times in high rainfall seasons, up to 30, 40, 45% yield gain from that foliar fungicide just to protect the yield potential in susceptible varieties, right? In growing seasons that are conducive to more diseases. So we're talking about a range of different things, and I just gave a bird's eye view here, just a very general idea of some of the things that we're talking about. But growers seem to be very interested in asking many questions. Some of these meetings, they ran like 2 hours long, even though we had like a single presentation. And that was because growers were just like going back and forth and asking questions. And so it has been a lot of fun to see growers face to face again in this setting and be able to discuss some of the management practices that we need to be thinking about for maximizing yield, quality, and profit.
Well, before we move on to variety selection directly here, you highlighted fungicide use just a second ago, and that has really picked up and become more and more routine for producers the last 10, 15 years, something like that. That is a good illustration and maybe evidence, Romulo, that intensive wheat management in and of itself can pay off for the producer. That could serve as a shining example, if you will, could it not?
Most definitely, we need to be paying attention to what the crop needs, right? It's my go-to sentence there whenever we're talking about our intensive management. It's nothing more than really watching the crop closely. It's not necessarily going over in terms of inputs or anything like that. It's just giving what the crop needs. And more recently, we got data from close to 700 fields all over the state in terms of how growers are managing their fields in a commercial setting. And we develop, you can call it management packages, right, that are reflecting those growers that are the 20% lowest yielding growers among that survey, the average yielding grower, the 20% highest yielding grower, and finally the 5% top yielding growers, right? So we developed 4 management packages, and they differ for central locations and for western locations. And this last year, we ran that study more or less like a boots on the ground, right? Ground truthing what growers are doing in their fields through the replicated experiments. And it was very interesting to notice that if we're managing like the lower yielding growers, our yield levels that we were getting were close to that 35 to 40 bushel mark. Once we replicated what the average yielding grower in Kansas is doing from our survey, our average yield among locations was 57 bushels per acre, which is remarkably close to the state average of this year, which was 55. So it really tells that our survey was representing what growers are doing. So if we manage like the top 20% of the growers are doing, we brought that yield up to about 68, 69. So there was a 13, 14 bushel per acre yield gain from going from the average grower to the top 20%. But we are looking at the quality now, which is a very important aspect for wheat production here in Kansas, right? The milling and baking quality. So we are trying to figure out whether there will be a gain in quality, even though we might not be seeing a gain in yield.
Interesting data that is, and information for our growers. But success so often, if not almost always, starts with variety selection, Romulo. And we'd like to go over a few principles there with you after the break. Romulo Lollato with us, wheat production specialist with K-State Research and Extension. And we'll return with him shortly here on Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today returns now, and in touch with Romulo Lollato, wheat production specialist, K-State Research and Extension. What we're doing on this segment is covering some of the high points of this write-up, part of the Wheat RX informational series that K-State Research and Extension and the Kansas Wheat Commission are collaborating on and focusing on variety selection, Romulo. And naturally, producers are initially interested in the yield potential of any given wheat variety. Is that where we start?
Hi, Eric. Yeah, so definitely that's the main product of interest, right? Whenever we think of the amount of varieties that we have in the market today, that kind of poses a challenge because we think, okay, how do we sift through all of those varieties and make an informed decision, right? And in the end, it comes down to yield performance. And that's why we have, through K-State, 20, 25 locations every year where we're testing these varieties and we're putting those reports out in terms of their performance. And if growers are close to the border from Oklahoma or from Colorado or even from Nebraska, those states also have their own variety trials that we can look into the data and make sure that the variety that we're interested at is actually consistently performing in a region. Now, I always like to talk to growers, and whenever we're talking about variety performance, it's extremely important for us not to look at a single location only or at a single year of data. Unless that location is within your own farm, right, there's quite a bit of variability there. So if we're looking at within your own farm, and you have a yield history there, that's one thing. But if not, usually there's enough homogeneity in the region that we can look at nearby variety trials, right? And the reason we don't look at a single year and or a single location of data is because there's so much variability in growing conditions for wheat in Kansas, year-to-year variability, that if we choose based on the highest yielding variety of 1 year or in one location, very likely it's not going to be the highest yielding variety next year or in a different location. So we're kind of looking for consistency, right? We're looking for varieties that are consistently rising towards the top, either above 100% of the average or above the 110% of the average, even better, right? So we need to look at several locations within a region, preferably several years as well, so we get more weather variability there. And whenever one or some varieties are starting to consistently show up as above average, definitely those become good candidates for us to have in our short list and helps narrow down the number of options that we have.
One thing, though, and you note this in the article that is of utmost importance here, matching that yield potential to the yielding conditions that you'll be planting that seed into. And those need to click, don't they?
Most definitely, Eric. And the way that we look at that is some varieties, they are what we call racehorse, meaning that if the conditions are there, they're really going to respond. They're going to rise towards the top. Other varieties, they're more stable, right? They're more kind of like workhorse varieties that they're kind of consistently above average, but they're not necessarily shining towards the top, right? So that there might be a trade-off there between the yield potential and the stability of some of these varieties. Ideally, we would like a variety that can handle tough conditions well and has the potential to bounce whenever the conditions are favorable. And we also suggest the growers use that as a tool when selecting varieties. So if they have, for example, a high-yielding bottom ground field with a history of manure that has a very high fertility, so that that field per se has the conditions to be very high yielding and has a history of high yield performance there, probably selecting a variety that matches those conditions would benefit, because then you can put a racehorse variety in a situation where it's more likely to express that potential. Now, we know that farmers, they farm many fields, and some fields have a lower potential than others. So sometimes you're farming a field that has more of a slope, or that the soil doesn't hold as much water, or simply that you recently bought it and the previous owner did not treat the soil correctly. And so there is some homework to be done for the soil to catch up in terms of quality. So many other things that just make that field a lower yielding field. And so some varieties that are more stable might be beneficial in those conditions. So for sure, knowing the yield history in each field can help narrow down that option as well, and justify selecting different varieties for different fields in the farm.
Now, growers tend to gravitate toward a specific variety each year that they find favor with. However, you advocate that spreading the risk, if you will, by planting multiple varieties over a given farm would be worthwhile.
Most definitely. We always suggest that growers should consider, whenever feasible, and depends on the number of acres as well, to spread their risk by planting different varieties. And one of the reasons we suggest that is, again, the variety that yielded the best last year might not be the best next year. And so by doing that, by selecting more than one, by having 3, 4, or even 5, depending on the size of the farm, varieties, you're actually increasing your chances to have that highest yielding one as one of the package that you're selecting, right? So that's one of the reasons why we suggest. Another reason is by spreading maturities of those varieties, right? To have some early maturing varieties, you have some medium maturing varieties, and then you have some fuller cycle type of varieties. We can actually capitalize on however the weather turns out to be. We don't know how the weather is going to be next season. So by spreading the risk, we can help capitalize that. And the reason maturity becomes so important in those conditions is that if we have a year such as 2012 or 2018, when it was very hot and dry, those years, early maturing varieties were doing better simply because they finished before a lot of the heat and drought came by. On the other hand, if you have a year such as 2016 or 2019 or even 2021 now, with very good growing conditions in the spring, where you have cool temperatures and we have above average moisture, those conditions tend to benefit later maturing varieties more. So if the year turns out to be like that, later maturing varieties will be benefited. So that's why, again, we try to suggest spreading the risk. And those later maturing varieties, they're going to be less prone to some freeze damage as well, right? So important to really spread the risk and spread your harvest as well, right? Sometimes there are a good week or so in differences between when an early maturing variety is ready to harvest versus a late maturing one. And that helps spread your harvest timing across the farm as well.
Well, there are numerous aspects to variety selection, which we won't cover in full today. I do want to mention, though, one more, also highlighted in this article, varieties' tolerance to abiotic factors. Now, that gets back to knowing your fields, by and large, right?
Most definitely knowing your fields. And this also comes back to where in the state is your farm located, right? And so, because abiotic factors, they tend to be regionalized like that. And so, for example, if you're a grower in Western Kansas, of course, you're looking for drought tolerance in some of those varieties because drought is a reoccurring factor in that part of the state. If you're a grower in South Central Kansas, where it turns hot really early, you might be benefiting from early maturing varieties. And so there are many abiotic factors that we can consider. Some of them we can even manage. So, for example, acid soils. But in a year where it might not be economical to manage acid soils, you do have the option of selecting varieties with better tolerance. And this is more of a problem in Central Kansas. We're seeing from South Central to North Central Kansas, many fields testing in that low 5 in terms of pH. And that's definitely a range where there are differences in variety performance. So these are the type of things that we go over in that publication with Variety Selection, which is the first publication out of a series of several within that Wheat RX program. But Eric, I would like to mention just another quick thing the growers must consider when selecting a wheat variety, which is the cropping system. Right? Which cropping system is that variety going to be established at? And these will be field specific. So say about half of the fields in Central Kansas nowadays are being planted after soybeans, right? So we know that in those conditions, the soil is going to be drier, the wheat is going to be planted later, so less time to tiller, less time to develop in the fall, and all of that's going to delay the entire cycle of the crop. So really what we're looking for in those conditions is good tillering potential despite a late planting, and hopefully an earlier maturity so growers can actually try to avoid being caught on the heat in a crop that is already being planted late. About the same situation for wheat being planted after corn in Western Kansas. Many times it's pushed out well behind its optimal planting date. Now, if we're looking at wheat after wheat, that is still a common practice in many parts of the state. We might be looking at some varieties with good disease tolerance to some of those early season diseases, such as 10 spot, that can actually help control some of those without the need of fungicide. So many things that growers should be considering whenever they are making their variety selection, including the cropping system where that variety is going to be established as well.
Take advantage, producers, of the abundance of information that's available out there on variety performance and selection. And start with this article that Romulo references. It's in the Wheat RX series that was just launched. Go to kswheat.com/wheatrx, and you'll find the very first entry in this series on variety selection. Romulo, we'll have you back again, undoubtedly, as we roll ever closer to drilling wheat in Kansas. In the meantime, the best in these forthcoming pre-plant wheat schools that Extension will sponsor throughout the state. And thanks for joining us right here.
Thank you, Eric. It was great to talk to you and to our growers.
Romulo Lollato is a wheat production specialist with K-State Research and Extension, and you're listening to Agriculture Today. You're listening to Agriculture Today, our Thursday edition. And again, thanks for joining us. Eric Atkinson here. And now on to today's agricultural news headlines in brief. These courtesy in part of DTN. A single EPA document purportedly shows that at least some agency officials expressed concern about a possible cancer link to the herbicide glyphosate. That's the subject of a battle playing out in federal appeals court. Glyphosate-based Roundup is set to be pulled from commercial shelves, by the way, by 2023. Glyphosate received its most recent approval from the EPA in 2020, and Bayer announced earlier this year that action would not affect agriculture, but was part of a plan to reduce the company's exposure to future Roundup lawsuits. The groups suing the agency have argued in a series of reply briefs filed in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit in San Francisco that a 2016 internal EPA document should be made part of the record because it runs contrary to the agency's public decision. Now, the agency declared glyphosate was safe and found no connection to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Attorneys for the EPA and Bayer have argued in their own reply briefs that the document was only part of internal deliberations and should not be included in the record. Although Bayer has since announced the plans to pull Roundup from commercial shelves, that company said in a brief filed on Monday that it stands by the science showing that glyphosate is safe. 2 of 4 antitrust lawsuits filed against Archer Daniels Midland, alleging ethanol market manipulation, were dismissed this week by a federal court in Illinois. The remaining 2 cases are still on track for trial in 2024. The U.S. District Court for the Central District of Illinois in Urbana dismissed lawsuits filed by Green Plains Trade Group and Midwest Renewable Energy. Those lawsuits all allege that ADM intentionally manipulated and artificially depressed the price of ethanol by targeting ethanol sales activity at the Argo Terminal in Illinois. That Argo Terminal, the daily location for ethanol trading, the 30-minute trading window at the terminal, is considered crucial because it's used to set the daily Chicago benchmark price to determine the value of Chicago ethanol derivatives. That benchmark then used to price and settle ethanol derivatives on the New York Mercantile Exchange and the Chicago Board of Trade. Now, Green Plains was alleging that ADM had uneconomically shipped ethanol to Argo when prices at the terminal were already lower than those at other terminals. Plaintiffs alleged that ADM sacrificed its profits on physical ethanol sales to leverage even larger profits on derivatives contracts. The court also dismissed a similar lawsuit brought by Midwest Renewable Energy on August the 9th, ruling in part that ADM's actions did not constitute antitrust injury, in other words, did not result in reduced output or higher prices. USDA Deputy Secretary Jewel Bernal has announced the establishment of a $400 million dairy donation program. Here's a glance at that from the USDA's Rod Bain.
USDA's new nationwide dairy donation program is based on similar original efforts in Michigan.
The partnership started a few years ago between Michigan milk producers and the Food Bank Council of Michigan.
Senate Agriculture Committee Chair Debbie Stabenow talking to reporters Wednesday about her home state inspired DDP when increased child nutrition efforts took place to counter impacts from the Flint, Michigan water crisis.
Michigan milk producers were the first ones to step up and team up with the Food Bank of Eastern Michigan, Kroger, Michigan State Extension, and they donated more than 36,000 gallons of milk.
Michigan Milk Producers Association CEO Joe Diglio acknowledges the $400 million dairy donation program also builds upon existing federal programs like the 2018 Farm Bills,
milk donation reimbursement program,
and dairy donation partnerships. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Now, under this dairy donation program, eligible dairy organizations will partner with nonprofit feeding organizations that distribute food to individuals and families in need with the USDA, then receive reimbursements for the dairy products that are donated. The goal to provide dairy product donations at times when traditional purchase programs don't move quickly enough. Next up on Agriculture Today, this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update, and standing by is Greg Akagi. Greg?
Kendall Heininger joins us. She is from Fairview, and her husband Austin are part of the American Soybean Association Young Leaders Program. And Kendall, I know it has been a busy time, and that includes some traveling you and your husband did with the Young Leaders Group.
It does. So recently took us to Vancouver, Washington to participate in the summer meeting there for the American Soybean Association and learn a little bit more about what it looks like to be a leader in the soybean associations.
What are some of the things that they have you guys do as far as training and skill work that you would have for that?
So this has been our first phase, and so far we've done some training based on, they let us know kind of the agri-science that Corteva sponsors, because Corteva is the one who puts on this Young Leaders program through the American Soybean Association. We've done disc assessments to kind of see where we fit on that personality scale and that leadership, and kind of using our own personality to learn and grow further. We have government affairs updates come in, marketing. For some of us who've never networked before, we get to kind of learn how to network with other farmers and growers in our community across the country. For those of us who have networked before, we're not learning. We're just getting to get actively involved with others as well and see their productions and learn what they do. We do some communications, online, social media interactions, just kind of teach us how to present our story better.
You talked about networking. How much fun has that been to get to know the other couples and the other people who are part of the Young Leaders Program?
Actually, it's been a blast. It was a great group of people. I'm so excited to see them again in November. We have a group Snapchat going, so I have a blast following their farms and their families and keeping in touch with what they're doing. So getting to know them and learning about their production has been really cool.
If you know of couples that are out there, or if anyone who is listening that's a younger couple, why should they apply to be a part of the Young Leaders Program?
If not you, then who? It's really common for us to talk about our needs amongst each other where we're comfortable. But if we're not the ones out there talking about how things affect us and what we're doing on our farms and letting people see it, then other people have a voice and they'll use it. So I encourage everyone to learn what you can do to educate and inform and inspire the world around you.
That is Kendall Heininger from Fairview. Her and her husband, Austin, are a part of the American Soybean Association Young Leaders Program as she joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
All right, Greg, many thanks. Greg Akagi there. We'll be back with more for you after this. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Next up on Agriculture Today, we're around to another K-State horticulture segment and previewing once more another of those K-State Garden Hour webinars this coming Wednesday, September the 1st. This one will concentrate on succeeding with growing berry crops here in Kansas. And lending expertise on that topic during the webinar, our guest now, Rebecca McMahon, Sedgwick County Extension horticulture agent. She'll be talking the prospects of berry production up. And ask you this right out, Rebecca, is the state of Kansas a berry production friendly state?
Oh, you start right with the hard question. So I would say yes, but also no. A lot of it depends on what type of berry you want to grow. And then it really is critical to choose the correct varieties and be extremely careful with your site selection, your planting location. So you can have exceptional berry crops in Kansas. You just don't have as much leeway for errors as you might with some other plants that you choose to grow.
And we need to list what we're talking about for Kansas. Strawberries, we're familiar with raising those in so many gardens, but we're looking at raspberries, blackberries, you say even blueberries. There's quite an array that can be successfully grown in the state, you say.
Right. So, the most common berry crops, certainly the strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, are relatively easy to grow in Kansas. Blueberries are quite another matter in most parts of Kansas. And so during the garden hour session, we'll definitely go into that in a little more detail. And then once you kind of get beyond that, depending on how you want to define berries, certain grapes can be grown very easily in Kansas. And then you've got a whole bunch of other things that can be grown, but maybe aren't people's favorites. Things like elderberries, currants and gooseberries get even more challenging due to the weather. And then a range of kind of less common things like aronia berries and all kinds of good stuff like that. So, for the garden hour, we're going to be mostly focusing on more common fruit varieties, strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, that sort of thing.
You mentioned a second ago that variety selection is all important here. Are there general guidelines by which folks could make those good selections? By what means?
So this is a point where it becomes partly about what you are hoping to get out of your fruit crop, as well as being extremely honest with yourself about your growing conditions. So some of the challenges that we face are heavy clay soils and sometimes very alkaline soils. And so if you have those sorts of situations, there's things you can do to mitigate that with raised beds or berms or so on. But it's important to look for varieties that are tolerant of heavier soils. And maybe even beyond that, might be tolerant to some of the diseases that occur when their plants are in a poorly drained location. So kind of that combination of what type of soil it'll tolerate and disease resistance. And then, again, our weather, our cold temperatures, our hot temperatures. It is sometimes tricky to find varieties that are both sufficiently cold tolerant to go through the winter, although not as difficult as you might imagine. And then on the flip side, to find varieties that will maintain good fruit quality even when exposed to hot temperatures, even earlier in the season than we might expect. So finding a raspberry variety that's going to tolerate hot temperatures sometimes is easier said than done with our weather conditions. So just being really honest about your soil, the weather, stress, and looking for varieties that are going to tolerate those things are so important. And then once you get past those questions, disease resistance, partly because of the heavy clay soils, is extremely important. And then with whatever is left on your list, you want to really think about, what do you want from your fruit crop? Are you looking for certain flavor characteristics, berry size, firmness, yield? Are you wanting to have something that you can process, into jam or into the freezer? Are you just wanting to eat fresh? All of those questions come into play. So I've just started talking about variety selection, so I don't know how I'm going to fit it all into 1 hour for the garden hour, but we'll do what we can.
Indeed. A slew of things to think about here. Are these all regarded as high-maintenance crops, or can one enjoy the experience here without going overboard?
You can't expect a fruit crop to be low maintenance if you want a high-yielding, high-quality return. Mm-hmm. However, if you are happy to get a few handfuls of berries while you're out in your yard, and if the birds or critters get some of them and the plants don't have to look perfect, no, they don't have to be as high maintenance as you might expect.
And you would suggest that folks maybe be adventurous here. You're not discouraging them in any way. Give it a try, if nothing else, if it's of appeal to them.
Exactly. I love growing fruit, even though I will be honest, I am frustrated sometimes growing fruit in Kansas. But, for me, I've got, young kids, and it is worth it to me to see them excited to go out and dig through and pick strawberries and eat them, even if I never, ever have enough to make a pie out of them.
Very good. To the garden hour itself and how folks may participate.
Yeah, so if you've already registered for a past garden hour, then you should get that email with the information and the link and be able to jump on just like for past weeks. If you have not yet registered, then you can go on to the K-State Garden Hour website and sign up for that webinar, and then again you'll get the email with the link and all that good stuff.
It's, again, a free program, and it's taking place over the noon hour this coming Wednesday, September the 1st. And it's a great series, as we've been talking it up here all along. This time around, the topic is the basics of growing berries in Kansas. Simply search for K-State Garden Hour in your search engine of choice. That'll take you to that website. Best of luck with this presentation upcoming. Rebecca, thanks for sharing a few moments with us.
I'll look forward to seeing everyone there.
She's Rebecca McMahon, Sedgwick County Extension Horticulture Agent, and that is this week's Horticulture segment, closing out this Thursday edition. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.